A storm raged outside the passenger car window, lightning splitting the skies over the dusty plains of Kansas. Charlotte Miller gripped the hands of her 5-year-old twins as the train screeched into Cedarwood Creek Station, her new home, or so she hoped. She'd traveled countless miles, answering an advertisement promising security and love in exchange for becoming a rancher's bride. Yet unease gnawed at her as she stepped onto the deserted platform. Was she walking into a dream come true, or a nightmare with no way out? Only fate knew, and soon the entire town would be shaken by her arrival, one that came with unexpected baggage. Charlotte Miller was no stranger to hardship. Born and raised on the outskirts of St. Louis, Missouri, a city whose bustling streets were a far cry from the remote frontiers of the West, she had lost her parents to cholera at a young age. From that moment on, survival became her daily pursuit. At 23, she had already experienced more sorrow than many who lived decades longer. The idea of a mail-order marriage wasn't born out of romance or even preference. It sprouted from desperation. The last few years had seen Charlotte working long hours as a seamstress while caring for her twin children, Daisy and Daniel. Their father had been a soldier in the Union Army, swept into violence, and never returned from a distant battlefield. Penniless and alone, Charlotte struggled to pay rent and feed her children. Jobs for single mothers were scarce, and no respectable men in St. Louis seemed willing to marry a widow with children. Then came a letter in the local paper, an advertisement from a man named Gideon Turner, who claimed to own a prosperous ranch outside Cedarwood Creek, Kansas. He was seeking a kind-hearted woman to share his life, promising stability, a comfortable home, and a future that Charlotte's current circumstances couldn't begin to rival. She had hardly known what to think when she wrote him back. Days turned into weeks as they exchanged letters, tentative, hopeful confessions about the kind of life they envisioned. In Gideon's letters, Charlotte found glimpses of sincerity. He wrote of starry nights over wide open prairies, the smell of fresh hay in the barn, the steady rhythm of ranch life that offered peace. She was honest about having children, but in her haste and fear of rejection, she never fully described the challenges of raising them alone. She mentioned Daisy and Daniel only briefly, perhaps hoping love and compassion would overshadow any reluctance he might have. Gideon's final letter came with a ticket to Cedarwood Creek. "I believe in building a family," he wrote. "I look forward to your arrival and the blessings you'll bring." Those words shone like a beacon in Charlotte's darkest hour. She gave notice at her job, tearfully bid farewell to the cramped attic she rented, and packed up her small trunk with everything they owned. With her children in tow, she boarded a train for what she believed would be the start of a new, brighter chapter. Throughout the journey, as the train chugged over the rails, Charlotte fantasized about a small, cozy home on Gideon's ranch. She pictured Daisy and Daniel running through tall grass, laughing in the sunshine, while she looked on contentedly. It wasn't just romance she yearned for. It was refuge, acceptance, and security. She wanted her children to grow up safe and never know the gnawing hunger and fear that had dominated her life. Yet there was a tickle of worry in the back of her mind. What if Gideon had second thoughts upon seeing her in person? What if the reality of motherhood was more daunting than he had anticipated? Even as the train whistle blew and the conductor announced their arrival in Cedarwood Creek, Charlotte prayed that she hadn't been deceived by promises etched only in ink. Little did she know the greatest test of her courage was still to come. The train ride ended in a tumult of whirring brakes and hissing steam. When Charlotte peeked out the window, her eyes fell upon a modest wooden station bathed in the pale glow of early evening. Cedarwood Creek was far smaller than St. Louis, with a single dusty main street, lined by a handful of wooden shops, a saloon, a small church steeple in the distance, and a livery stable near the station. The wide plains rolled out on every side, marked by the occasional dot of a farmhouse or grazing cattle. Daisy and Daniel clung to Charlotte's skirts as they stepped onto the platform. The few townsfolk present either disembarked the train or waited to greet arriving passengers. Each stranger's gaze felt like a spotlight on Charlotte's little family. She took a deep breath, reminded herself of Gideon's kind letters, and scanned the crowd for a man who might be waiting with outstretched arms. Moments later, she spotted him. Gideon Turner stood a short distance away, wearing a broad-brimmed hat and a neat denim shirt tucked into practical brown trousers. He had an air of quiet confidence, a tall frame, and strong shoulders that suggested years of hard work on a ranch. His dark hair curled slightly beneath his hat, and he appeared younger than Charlotte had imagined, perhaps around 30. Gideon lifted a hand, a tentative smile crossing his face. Relief washed over Charlotte as she recognized him from the tintype he had mailed in one of his letters. With Daisy and Daniel in tow, Charlotte approached Gideon. She noticed his initial smile falter when his eyes shifted from her face down to the two small children clutching her hands. There was a flicker of something surprise, maybe even disapproval. She tried to ignore it, wearing her own timid smile. "Mr. Turner, I'm Charlotte Miller." He removed his hat in greeting. "Pleased to meet you," he said, though his voice lacked the warmth of his letters. "I wasn't aware you were bringing both of them." The question hovered awkwardly as he cleared his throat. Charlotte's heart sank. Hadn't she mentioned her twins in her letters? Perhaps not in the detail necessary. But she was sure she'd written that she was a mother. "Yes, these are my children, Daisy and Daniel," she said softly. "I wrote that I had children. It's in my second letter." Gideon pressed his lips together. "I might have missed that detail, or perhaps I didn't realize they were so old. I mean, they're quite grown." Daisy and Daniel, sensing the uncomfortable tension, hid behind Charlotte's skirts. She noticed a guarded look settle over Gideon's face. Still, Charlotte clung to the hope that once he spent time with the children, he would see how gentle and loving they were. He forced a smile and extended his hand to Daniel. "Nice to meet you, son." He greeted the boy, who gave him a hesitant nod. Then Gideon turned to Charlotte. "Let's head to the wagon. We've got a good ways to travel before we reach the ranch." His tone was polite, but distant. Anxiety churned in Charlotte's stomach as she led Daisy and Daniel toward the waiting wagon. She wondered with growing dread if Gideon's polite veneer would hold up against the truth of their new reality, that she came as a complete family package. Cedarwood Creek already felt like a frontier of uncertainty. As she climbed into the wagon, Charlotte prayed she hadn't come all this way for heartbreak. The journey to Gideon's ranch took them across miles of rolling prairie. At first, Charlotte tried to break the ice with polite conversation. She asked about the ranch, the cattle, and the horses. Gideon responded with curt, one-word answers. His earlier gentleness, expressed in ink, seemed to have vanished into the sprawling sky. Daisy and Daniel exchanged nervous glances, sensing the distance between the two adults. Eventually, the wagon rattled through a gate and came to a stop in front of a modest homestead. It featured a small but sturdy wooden house, a barn, a chicken coop, and a neatly fenced corral where horses grazed. The land seemed spacious, with acres of pasture stretching out under the setting sun. By all accounts, it was a place of potential comfort. But Charlotte could not ignore the heavy silence. Even the children felt it quickly dismounting and staying close to her side rather than wandering off in curiosity. Gideon busied himself with unhitching the horses. Then he turned, eyes flicking between the twins and Charlotte. "I've made arrangements for you inside," he said, gesturing to the house. "There's a spare room. Why don't you and your children settle in while I finish up the chores?" His hesitation was like a paper cut, small yet sharp and stinging. Charlotte mustered a polite nod. Inside the house, she found simple furnishings, a small kitchen table, a wood-burning stove, and a living area with a single worn couch. The guest room was no bigger than a closet containing a narrow bed and a trunk for storage. There was little room for 2 growing children. Exhausted from the journey, the 3 of them set down their belongings. Daisy rubbed her eyes while Daniel yawned widely. Charlotte could almost feel Gideon's apprehension pressing against the walls. It was as though the room itself bristled with tension. After an awkward supper of dried beef and beans, during which Gideon barely spoke a word, Charlotte finally tucked the children into bed. They slept huddled next to each other on the single mattress. She decided to step outside, hoping to speak privately with Gideon. She found him standing on the porch, gazing out at the starlit fields. She cleared her throat. "It's a beautiful place," she ventured softly. He nodded, not taking his eyes off the horizon. "Sure is. I'm sorry if I wasn't clear about the children," she said, trying to swallow her pride. "But I never lied, Gideon. I was up front that I had twins. I understand that it might be more than you bargained for." He exhaled, finally turning to face her. In the silver light of the moon, his features looked etched with uncertainty. "I thought maybe they were just babies," he said, as though that made a difference. "I'm not prepared to take on the responsibility of older children schooling, feeding them, clothing them. I was thinking we'd, start our own family. Gradually." Hurt rippled through Charlotte. She took a breath. "Gideon, these children have no one else," she said firmly. "I came here believing you wanted a family. I won't abandon Daisy and Daniel." His eyes hardened. "I'm not sure this will work, Charlotte." With that, he turned and retreated into the house, leaving Charlotte standing under the star-scattered sky, her dreams trembling on the brink of collapse. She felt the night wind brush her cheeks like a cold whisper, warning her that this new life was not the promise she had hoped for. Morning came too soon. The sunrise gilded the plains in a soft glow. But to Charlotte, it felt more like an interrogation lamp, exposing the reality she desperately tried to deny. She rose quietly, careful not to wake Daisy and Daniel, then stepped outside, hoping to find Gideon in a more receptive mood. She found him already at work, tossing feed for the chickens. His greeting was short. He avoided eye contact. Despite the pang in her heart, Charlotte offered to help with the chores, determined to show her worth. She fetched water from the well-gathered eggs and tried to strike a conversation about how she could be of use around the ranch, cooking, washing, sewing. Gideon responded with guarded politeness, but it was clear his mind was elsewhere. Eventually, he asked her to meet him inside. They settled at the small table, the air tense. Her stomach twisted with dread even before he started speaking. "Charlotte," he began carefully, "I've been thinking all night. What we have here, what I expected, and what you came here for, doesn't match up. I wanted a wife who'd help me build a family from the ground up. You've already got a family. I don't blame you, but it's more than I can handle right now." Her heart pounded. She'd left everything behind to be here. "Gideon, I understand your concerns," she said. "But your letters suggested—" He cut her off. My letters were from a time I thought I could handle anything. But the ranch has had a tough year. The cattle prices are down. There's debt, and I'm not sure I can provide for you and 2 children. Tears threatened to well in Charlotte's eyes, but she kept them at bay. We can work together, can't we? Isn't that the point of marriage partnership? Gideon sighed, looking genuinely torn. I'm sorry, Charlotte, but I just can't see it working. I've prayed on this. I can't let you stay in false hope. The finality in his words hit her like a punch to the chest. She'd gambled everything only to be cast aside. And what will I do now? She asked, her voice breaking, despite her best efforts to keep it steady. I have no money, no place to go. I'll give you some money for a hotel in town, he offered, which felt more like a dismissal than a kindness. It's not much, but it'll tide you over until you figure out your next steps. Before she could reply, Daisy and Daniel appeared in the doorway, wearing the worried expressions of children who understood far more than adults realized. They said nothing, but their eyes darted from their mother to Gideon, reading the tension like an open book. Gideon stood abruptly and placed a few coins on the table. I'll drive you into Cedarwood Creek. I'm truly sorry. Charlotte swallowed hard, feeling tears burning at the edges of her eyes. She looked at the coins, aware that she was staring at the sum total of Gideon's sense of responsibility toward them. Gathering her resolve, she squared her shoulders. Then I guess we'll be leaving, she managed to say. She rose, took Daisy and Daniel by the hand, and followed Gideon out to the wagon. With each step, her dream crumbled beneath her feet, turning into dust that scattered across the unforgiving Kansas prairie. By the time they reached town, Charlotte wondered if her future held any glimmer of hope, or if she'd been destined for heartbreak all along. Cedarwood Creek's main street was a far cry from the possibilities Charlotte had imagined. Wooden sidewalks bordered dusty lanes, and a handful of businesses struggled to bring life to the small settlement. There was a saloon with swinging doors called the Lucky Horseshoe, a general store owned by a portly man named Mr. Wheeler, and a modest church at the far end. Across from the store sat a simple boarding house run by Mrs. Franklin. Gideon parked the wagon outside the boarding house, helped Charlotte and the children down, then handed her a small pouch of coins. There's enough here for a few nights' stay, he said. Maybe a meal or 2. I wish you well. He tipped his hat stiffly, then turned the wagon around, leaving in a cloud of dust. It was so abrupt that Daisy burst into tears. Daniel clung to his mother's skirts, trying to be brave, despite his evident fear. Charlotte steeled herself. She had 2 children to comfort. She kneeled to their eye level. We'll figure this out, she whispered, though her heart pounded with uncertainty. Mama will make things right. Inside the boarding house, Mrs. Franklin eyed them with a mixture of concern and curiosity. She was a robust woman, with a kindly face, her graying hair pinned into a neat bun. You look like you've had a rough morning, she said, ushering them inside. Come in. Sit down. I'll make some tea. Grateful. Charlotte guided the children into the parlor. Mrs. Franklin returned with steaming cups of tea and small cookies for Daisy and Daniel. How'd you come to be in Cedarwood Creek? The landlady asked gently. Charlotte hesitated, then gave a condensed version of their predicament, careful not to let emotion overwhelm her words. I was to be a mail-order bride, she explained. But it didn't work out. Mrs. Franklin's brow furrowed. That Gideon Turner, eh? I've seen a few women come and go under similar circumstances. She sighed. He's not a bad man, but he's picky and has had trouble settling. Sometimes he doesn't think about how his choices affect others. Charlotte's cheeks flushed. That might be so, but right now we're stranded. I need to find a place for us. Mrs. Franklin patted her hand. Well, I do have a small room I can let you for a few days. We can work out the details later if you decide to stay longer. There's a schoolhouse down the street where the children can attend. And perhaps you can find work in town. Mr. Wheeler at the general store sometimes needs help. It was a meager hope, but Charlotte clung to it. She could sew, cook, and clean. Maybe she could earn enough to keep a roof over their heads until she figured out a longer-term plan. She nodded. Thank you, Mrs. Franklin. We'll take the room for now. That evening, as Daisy and Daniel slept side by side in a cramped bed, Charlotte stared at the ceiling, her thoughts swirling. She felt betrayed, alone, and frightened. Yet a tiny spark of resolve glowed in her heart. She'd survived worse after all. Even here in a strange frontier town, she might still carve out a decent life for herself and her children. Where Gideon's rejection had left her in turmoil, the kindness of Mrs. Franklin offered the faintest glimmer of a fresh start, if only she could find the strength to seize it. Over the next few days, Charlotte tried to adjust to life in Cedarwood Creek. She helped around the boarding house by mending linens for Mrs. Franklin and offered to sew for townsfolk, hoping to earn some extra coins. Word spread quickly in a small town, and soon curious glance followed her. Wherever she went, accompanied by quiet whispers, "That's the woman Gideon Turner sent away." One morning, as Charlotte was returning from Mr. Wheeler's general store, Daisy tripped on a loose board in the sidewalk, scraping her knee. Charlotte knelt to inspect the bleeding wound. Daniel hovered close, eyes wide with worry. Just then, a tall man in his mid-30s approached his footsteps, purposeful. He wore a vest over a crisp white shirt, with sleeves rolled to his forearms, revealing the daily necessity of his profession. A small leather satchel dangled at his side. "Let me help," he offered in a gentle voice. "I'm Dr. Arthur Whitfield." With a practiced hand, he cleaned Daisy's scrape, applied a dab of salve, and bandaged it neatly. Charlotte watched, relieved to see Daisy's tears subside under the doctor's soothing manner. "Thank you, Dr. Whitfield," Charlotte murmured. "I appreciate your kindness." He gave a reassuring nod to Daisy and turned to Charlotte. "It's my pleasure. I try to keep the folks here healthy, especially the little ones." He glanced at Charlotte with evident curiosity. "You must be new in town. I don't believe we've met." She straightened. "I'm Charlotte Miller, and these are my children, Daisy and Daniel." He removed a glove, offering a handshake. "Charmed to meet you all. If you need anything, medical or otherwise, don't hesitate to come by my clinic." He pointed to a small, whitewashed building near the edge of town. "I'm there most days." Charlotte thanked him again, noticing the warmth in his brown eyes. He had a solemn air about him, as though burdened by distant sorrow. Still, his courtesy was a balm in a town where people mostly seemed curious, but not particularly welcoming. Later, as she tucked Daisy and Daniel into bed at the boarding house, Charlotte couldn't stop thinking about Dr. Whitfield's gentle demeanor. Mrs. Franklin, ever watchful, seemed to read her mind when she brought extra blankets to the room that evening. "Arthur Whitfield is a good man," she remarked. "He lost his wife a couple years back to a fever outbreak. She was a sweet soul, folks say." Charlotte felt a pang of sympathy. "I'm sorry to hear that." Mrs. Franklin sighed. "He's dedicated to helping others, but that heartbreak runs deep. He used to talk about children of his own, but, well, it never happened. Sometimes tragedy has a way of stealing dreams." Charlotte understood that sentiment all too well. She thought of her own heartbreak, the father of her twins lost in the war, her failed arrangement with Gideon. Each of them carried ghosts of the past. "He's very kind," she said softly. Mrs. Franklin nodded. "Indeed he is." Then, leaving Charlotte alone with her thoughts, she closed the door gently behind her. That night, as the lamp flickered, and Daisy and Daniel slept soundly, Charlotte found herself ruminating on Dr. Whitfield's compassion. She was simply relieved to have encountered another person in Cedarwood Creek who treated her with dignity. At that point, she hardly dared hope for more. But fate, often unpredictable, had its own way of weaving paths together in the rough-and-tumble frontier. Work in Cedarwood Creek proved scarce for a woman like Charlotte, especially one who had to juggle caring for twins. She earned a few coins, sewing shirts for Mr. Wheeler's store and repairing threadbare curtains for the boarding house. But each evening she counted her money with grim recognition that it wouldn't last. The meager earnings barely covered their room and board, and Gideon's parting coins had long since dwindled. One afternoon, as Charlotte was mending a pile of trousers in the boarding house parlor, Dr. Whitfield appeared at the door. She stood promptly surprised by his visit. He gave a courteous nod. "Good afternoon, Miss Miller. Might I speak with you in private?" Her heart fluttered with apprehension. "Of course, Doctor. Let's step into the hallway." They walked into a quiet corner. "Is everything all right?" He seemed hesitant. "I hope you don't mind my intrusion. I've noticed your situation and realized you might need assistance. Cedarwood Creek isn't exactly brimming with opportunity for a single mother." She braced herself. "I'm managing as best I can. I appreciate your concern." Arthur shifted on his feet. "I have a proposition that might help both of us. My medical practice requires me to be on call at odd hours. My home is large for just one person. I've been considering hiring someone to help keep the house prepare meals and perhaps assist with paperwork. Would you be interested?" Charlotte blinked her mind, scrambling to process the offer. You'd employ me as a housekeeper." He nodded. "Yes, though it would go beyond housekeeping. You'd have a proper room for yourself and the children. I can pay you a decent wage enough for you to save something for your future. In return, I'd have help around the home." And he added gently, "Your children could have some stability." Her pride flared momentarily. She didn't want pity. But practicality loomed larger. This was the best opportunity she'd encountered. "It's a generous offer," she said carefully. "I just don't want to impose." He shook his head. "You wouldn't be imposing. In fact, I'd be grateful. Caring for a large home alone and running a full-time clinic is a strain. And if I'm honest, it might be nice to have the sound of children around." The house has been too silent. Charlotte glanced over at Daisy and Daniel, who were engrossed in a picture book. Visions of them sleeping in a comfortable home rather than this cramped boarding house filled her with relief. "Yes," she said, lifting her gaze to meet his. "I accept." A small smile touched Arthur's lips, as though he'd been hoping for that answer. "Wonderful. We can discuss the details tomorrow. For now, just know you have a place to stay, where you're welcome." Tears pricked Charlotte's eyes. This kindness stood in stark contrast to Gideon's cold dismissal. "Thank you, Dr. Whitfield. You don't know how much this means to us." He offered a humble nod. "You can call me Arthur," he said gently, before bidding her good day and leaving. Long after he departed, Charlotte remained standing in that hallway, a mixture of gratitude and a hint of cautious optimism swirling within her. Perhaps her journey to Cedarwood Creek wasn't a mistake after all. Maybe it was a detour, leading her toward a new kind of family. One born not of formal arrangements, but of compassion, shared need, and the faint spark of possibility. The following week, Charlotte and her children moved into Dr. Whitfield's home. It was a 2-story house at the edge of town, with a sweeping porch, bright windows, and rooms that felt both spacious and intimate. Arthur gave them free rein of the upper floor, allowing Daisy and Daniel to share a large room with 2 small beds. Charlotte's room adjoined it, giving her enough space for a small dresser and a nightstand. Compared to their cramped conditions in the boarding house, it was a revelation. Charlotte quickly settled into a routine, preparing breakfast, tidying the house, and assisting Arthur with his paperwork. She discovered the doctor's incredible dedication to his patients. He would wake in the middle of the night to deliver a baby or ride out to the far reaches of the prairie to tend a rancher's broken arm. Often he returned exhausted, covered in dust, and with a satchel nearly empty of supplies. Still, he never complained. Word of Charlotte's new arrangement spread through Cedarwood Creek like wildfire. The local gossips congregating at the general store or after Sunday church services whispered about the young mother and the widowed doctor living under one roof. Some saw it as scandalous. Others were merely intrigued. Gideon Turner, too, heard the chatter. Though he said little, Mrs. Franklin reported that he'd asked about Charlotte a few times in passing. His curiosity seemed tinged with jealousy, though he rarely came to town to see it firsthand. For Charlotte, the sting of Gideon's rejection still lingered, but the stability she now had began to overshadow that painful memory. Daisy and Daniel adjusted well, attending the schoolhouse, a short walk away. In the afternoons, they raced home to share stories of their lessons, breathless with excitement, while Charlotte prepared dinner. Arthur encouraged the twins to read books from his modest library, sometimes sitting with them by the fireplace to answer their endless questions about anatomy or faraway places. He seemed genuinely moved by their presence, as if a part of him longed for a family that he'd lost. Yet beneath the domestic harmony, tensions brewed. Charlotte sensed Arthur's grief when he spoke of his late wife, Claire. The pain in his eyes was raw, especially when Daisy or Daniel unknowingly asked if he had any children of his own. Meanwhile, the town's prying eyes occasionally made Charlotte uneasy. One morning, as she stepped onto the porch to shake out a rug, she noticed a neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, pausing on the sidewalk to stare disapprovingly. Charlotte merely offered a polite smile, but the older woman turned with a huff and went on her way. The constant speculation grated on Charlotte's nerves, reminding her that her position was precarious. One day, while Charlotte was scrubbing the kitchen floor, Arthur came home earlier than expected, his forehead creased in worry. "Gideon was in my office," he said. "He wanted me to tell you he intends to speak with you." Charlotte's heart lurched. She put down the brush. "What about Arthur?" shrugged. "I'm not certain. He said it was important. He seemed troubled." The news unsettled Charlotte. She wondered if Gideon regretted dismissing her, or maybe his pride was simply wounded by the gossip. Either way, her thoughts buzzed with possibilities. The fragile peace she'd found under Arthur's roof now stood at risk. Unable to guess Gideon's intentions, she braced herself for whatever storm might be brewing on the horizon. Little did she know, fate had far bigger plans in store for them all. By late afternoon, Gideon Turner arrived unannounced at Dr. Whitfield's home. Charlotte was tending to the twins in the front parlor, listening to their excited chatter about a spelling bee at school, when a firm knock on the door rattled the entire house. Her heart thumped heavily in her chest. She smoothed her apron and went to answer. Gideon's form filled the doorway, his expression set in grim determination. Before Charlotte could speak, Daisy and Daniel peeked around her skirt, instantly reminding Gideon of what he'd rejected. His gaze flickered over them, betraying a moment of guilt. "Charlotte, might we talk privately?" he asked, his tone more courteous than before. She hesitated, then turned to the twins. "Daisy, Daniel, please go find Dr. Whitfield in his study. Tell him Gideon is here all right." They complied, though they did so with reluctant glances at the man who had driven them away. Once they were gone, Charlotte led Gideon into the sitting room. The tension was palpable. She folded her arms, not out of hostility, but from a protective instinct that flared every time she remembered how he'd cast them aside. "What brings you here, Gideon?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He took off his hat and fiddled with it. "I've been thinking," he began. "My ranch is in better shape now cattle prices picked up, and I made a decent sale last week. I realized I acted hastily when I sent you away." He cleared his throat. "I came to... well, I want to see if you'd consider my proposal again." Shock and anger warred within Charlotte. She managed to keep her composure. "You mean you want to take back your rejection and marry me now?" "Yes," he said, a hint of relief in his voice. "I've given it a lot of thought. Folks in town have been talking about you and the doctor, which got me thinking. I don't like the idea of leaving you in a precarious position. I'm willing to provide for you and the children. We can try again." Charlotte felt her cheeks heat with indignation. Was he offering for her out of genuine remorse, or because he couldn't stand the gossip that someone else, particularly the widowed doctor, had stepped in? Her voice trembled with barely contained frustration. "You made it clear you didn't want the responsibility of my children, Gideon. What's changed?" He licked his lips, searching for words. "I was scared," he admitted. "I saw my profits dwindling, and I panicked, but I won't lie, seeing you live with another man in town, it just doesn't sit right with me." A wave of disappointment coursed through Charlotte. This wasn't love or real regret. It was pride and fear of judgment. "I see," she said coldly. "I'd already settled with Arthur as an employer. My children have found stability here. Why should I risk uprooting them again for someone who, when times get tough, turns away?" Gideon flinched at the blunt reminder of his earlier rejection. "I know I messed up. I'm asking for another chance." Just then footsteps approached, and Arthur stepped into the room, Daisy and Daniel at his heels. He placed a protective hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Is everything all right?" he asked, voice calm but firm. Charlotte met Arthur's gaze, drawing strength from it. Then she turned back to Gideon. "I appreciate the apology," she said, "but it's too late. I've found a place for myself and my children here, and I'm not inclined to gamble our future again." Gideon stiffened, his eyes darting between Charlotte and Arthur. He gave a stiff nod. "If that's your choice," he said tersely, "then I'll respect it." With that, he turned on his heel, stalked to the door, and let it slam behind him. Charlotte inhaled slowly, shaking from the encounter. Daisy and Daniel clung to her arms, their eyes wide with concern. Arthur knelt, reassuring the children that everything was all right, while Charlotte tried to push down the surge of adrenaline in her veins. Gideon's sudden proposal was unwelcome, but it also stirred her fears. Was she trading one uncertain arrangement for another? She glanced at Arthur, noticing how his presence alone steadied her nerves. In that moment, her heart whispered that the choice she'd made to stay felt right. With Gideon's abrupt departure, an uneasy calm settled over the household. Charlotte pressed forward, focusing on the tasks at hand, cooking, cleaning, and assisting Arthur with his ever-growing piles of medical notes. She found that the more time she spent in his company, the more she admired his quiet strength. He never pressed for details about her past, nor did he pass judgment on her situation. Each day brought small gestures of kindness. He would bring home extra fruit from a patient's orchard for the children, or slip a bit of candy into his doctor's bag for them. Yet late one evening, as Charlotte was tidying the front parlour, she overheard Arthur pacing in his study, his voice low and urgent. At first she thought he might be speaking to a patient who had arrived in a dire state. But when she peered around the corner, she saw him alone, talking to a framed photograph on his desk. It was a portrait of a woman with soft features and kind eyes, Claire, his late wife. "I'm sorry," he murmured, voice thick with emotion. "I don't mean to feel attracted to another woman. It's been 2 years, but sometimes it still feels like you're just out of reach." He ran a hand through his hair, leaning heavily on the desk. "I want to do right by Charlotte. She and the children deserve stability, love. But what if it's too soon?" Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't realized that Arthur might be grappling with his own demons, particularly regarding her. Quietly she withdrew, feeling as though she had witnessed a private confession, not meant for her ears. Her heart pounded in sympathy. She understood all too well the struggle between holding on to the past and stepping forward into the future. In the days that followed, Charlotte noticed Arthur's subtle changes in mood. He would drift between moments of warmth toward her children smiling when Daisy tugged his sleeve to show him her homework, or praising Daniel for learning a new word, and bouts of introspective silence. She saw the pain in his eyes whenever he glanced at the photograph of Claire. Despite this, he never withdrew his kindness from Charlotte or the twins. Meanwhile, rumors persisted in town. Some folks claimed that Charlotte had beguiled the widowed doctor for his money, while others pitied her for Gideon's betrayal. A few, like Mrs. Franklin, openly defended her, telling naysayers that Charlotte's good heart and strong work ethic were a blessing to Cedarwood Creek. Charlotte tried to ignore the gossip, grateful she had at least found a measure of security for her children. One evening, while Charlotte was reading to Daisy and Daniel by lantern light, Arthur joined them. He sat quietly at first, content to listen as Charlotte's voice wove through the story's pages. The children drifted off, lulled by the gentle narrative. Arthur lingered, eyes on the sleeping twins, a soft smile tugging at his lips. When Charlotte closed the book, he spoke quietly. "Thank you for doing this, for bringing some joy back into this house." She tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, heart fluttering. "I'm the one who should be thanking you, Arthur. You've given us a place to belong." Their gazes locked for a moment, a flicker of unspoken emotion passing between them. Hope, longing, perhaps guilt. Then, as though the spell had been broken, Arthur offered her a warm smile and excused himself, leaving Charlotte's mind buzzing with possibilities. Was it possible that beneath the practical arrangement, affection was quietly blooming? If so, could they both overcome their past pains to embrace a future together? As weeks turned into months, the rhythms of the household became second nature. Charlotte rose at dawn to prepare breakfast, saw Daisy and Daniel off to school, then helped Arthur in the clinic if he needed an extra hand with paperwork or managing supplies. She learned about medical herbs, sterilizing instruments, and the importance of a gentle bedside manner lessons that fascinated her and kept her occupied. All the while, the bond between Charlotte and Arthur deepened. They spent more time talking in quiet moments, him recalling fond memories of Claire's tenderness and the heartbreak of losing her Charlotte, sharing glimpses of her own life in St. Louis and the challenges of single motherhood. Where Gideon's letters had once promised understanding, Arthur's daily actions showed it. Still, each carried apprehensions. Charlotte sometimes wondered if, by developing feelings for Arthur, she was overshadowing Claire's memory. Would he ever be free of that guilt? And Arthur worried that his growing affection for Charlotte might be seen as a betrayal of his late wife. Despite the closeness, an invisible barrier remained between them, built on grief and caution. Then, on a blistering hot afternoon, the town was startled by an urgent crisis. A smallpox outbreak erupted in a nearby settlement. Rumors spread that infected travelers had passed through Cedarwood Creek, alarming everyone. Arthur sprang into action, setting up quarantine in the church's spare rooms and preparing vaccines for anyone who hadn't been exposed. He worked around the clock, Charlotte assisting him with errands, comforting the frightened families, and ensuring Daisy and Daniel stayed away from infected areas. Gideon reappeared in the midst of the crisis, not to see Charlotte directly, but because a few of his ranch hands fell ill. She occasionally caught glimpses of him in the makeshift clinic, worry etched on his face as he inquired about their condition. Though they hardly spoke, Charlotte couldn't ignore the lingering resentment and regret in his eyes. One evening, as Arthur tended to an especially sick ranch hand, Charlotte brought him fresh bandages and water. She found him pale and exhausted, but resolute. "You need rest," she insisted softly. "You'll fall ill yourself if you keep pushing." He shook his head, sweat beading on his brow. "These men depend on me. I have to keep going." Then Gideon strode in, face shadowed by the lamplight. "Doctor," he said urgently. "How is he?" Arthur paused in his work, looking at Gideon. "He's stable for now. But we need to be vigilant. Smallpox can turn quickly." Arthur wiped his brow and continued checking the patient's vitals. When Charlotte saw Gideon glance at her, she stiffened. The tension between them weighed heavily. He spoke hesitantly. "Charlotte, I'm sorry about everything. If anything happens to my men—" He trailed off, uncertain how to finish. Fear for his ranch hands overshadowed personal grievances. Charlotte nodded, though she offered no further words. She had no time or energy for his guilt right now. Arthur needed her help, and that was her priority. While Gideon lingered uncertain, Charlotte pressed a cool cloth to the patient's forehead, signaling that conversation was over. Over the next harrowing days, Arthur and Charlotte worked side by side, wrestling with exhaustion to care for the sick. Their closeness grew forged in the crucible of crisis. One night, when the last patient finally seemed out of danger, Arthur sank onto a chair in the church's back room. Charlotte gently offered him a cup of water, kneeling beside him. He took her hand, voice thick with gratitude and something deeper. "I couldn't have done this alone, Charlotte. You've been a godsend." A wave of emotion washed over her. Perhaps adversity was drawing them closer, forging a bond that mere daily routines never could. What she didn't realize was that the shifting tapestry of their relationship was about to reveal the final thread that tied them together, one that would challenge Arthur's grief and Charlotte's lingering sense of insecurity once and for all. With the smallpox scare finally subsiding, Cedarwood Creek breathed a collective sigh of relief. People returned to their normal routines, though many praised Dr. Whitfield and Charlotte for their tireless work in caring for the ill. The kindly Mrs. Franklin shared stories of their devotion, describing how Charlotte stayed up all night to nurse a feverish child, while Arthur handled emergencies from dawn until midnight. One late afternoon, when the crisis had fully passed, Arthur asked Charlotte to join him on the front porch. The children played in the yard, chasing each other with squeals of delight. The summer sun cast a golden glow across the plains, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange. Arthur settled into a rocking chair beside Charlotte and cleared his throat. "I've been thinking a lot lately." He began, gaze flicking from the horizon to her face. "You and the twins. You've changed this house, given it life again. I never imagined I could feel this sense of family after losing Claire. But it's here, and it's because of you." Her heart hammered. She remembered the conversation he'd had with Claire's photograph, the nights he tossed in guilt over moving on. "Arthur," she whispered, "I don't want to replace her." He reached for her hand, his voice breaking with emotion. "You're not replacing anyone. You're adding new joy to a life that was dark before. I believe Claire would want me to be happy to share my home and my heart." Tears welled in Charlotte's eyes. She squeezed his hand. Outside, Daisy giggled as Daniel stumbled in the grass. "I'm happy here," she admitted. "I never felt that I had a home of my own, until now." Arthur inhaled deeply, his next words trembling on his lips. "Charlotte, I've grown to care for you deeply. It isn't just gratitude for your help. It's love, or the beginnings of it. I want to marry you if you'll have me." His eyes glistened with earnest hope. "Will you be my wife, and will you let me be a father to Daisy? And Daniel?" Time seemed to stand still. Charlotte's breath caught. In those letters with Gideon, she had dreamed of a future where she wouldn't have to struggle alone. But that dream had proved hollow. Now confronted with Arthur's heartfelt proposal, she felt both overwhelmed and incredibly alive. She threw her arms around him, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. "Yes, Arthur, I'd be honored to marry you." A cheer from the yard made them break apart. Daisy and Daniel had overheard and were clapping their hands, wide grins on their small faces. Arthur rose, opened his arms, and the twins rushed into them, giggling. It wasn't a question of acceptance or rejection. Together, they formed a family. Not long after, Cedarwood Creek buzzed with news of the wedding announcement. Some raised eyebrows at how quickly the doctor had moved on from his late wife. Others cynically remarked that Charlotte was only seeking financial security. Yet the couple found immense support from friends like Mrs. Franklin, who saw genuine love blossoming. On a serene Sunday afternoon, under the open sky near the edge of the same plains that had once seemed so daunting to Charlotte, Arthur and Charlotte exchanged vows. Daisy and Daniel stood beside them, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. As the parson pronounced them husband and wife, a gentle breeze carried the scent of promise through the air. Their past sorrows merged into a future bright with hope. Where one man had once rejected Charlotte and her children, another man burdened by his own loss had found in them a reason to embrace life again. And so what began as a gamble for a mother in dire need ended as a new frontier of love for them all. In the heart of the Wild West, Charlotte discovered that family wasn't always determined by blood or a hasty arrangement, but by compassion, courage, and the willingness to seize a second chance when it truly mattered. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey through the untamed prairies of Cedarwood Creek. Charlotte's hope led her through heartbreak, and Arthur's compassion gave them all a new beginning. Their story reminds us that sometimes the greatest trials pave the way for unexpected blessings, and that love can bloom in the most unlikely places. If you found yourself swept up in the twists and turns of Charlotte and Arthur's story, show your support by hitting that like button. Share this video with friends who appreciate a heartfelt Western drama filled with resilience, redemption, and romance. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stirring tales of hope against the odds. Your engagement means the world to us, and we look forward to bringing you more captivating stories. Thanks for watching, and until next time, remember, love has a way of finding us even on the wildest frontiers.